Dad left us because Mom couldn't find work after giving birth to my sister. His reason? Not enough money for alcohol. I was 12. The last thing my dad said to me before slamming the door was, "I can't live in a house where I can't even afford a drink." I was 12. My baby sister was barely 2 months old, and my mom was sitting on the couch, clutching a stack of rejection letters from every job she'd applied for. He walked out that night and never came back, trading his family for the bottle. Before he left, I didn't fully understand how bad things were. To me, Dad was just Dad. He was gruff and loud, sure, but he was the one who taught me to ride my bike and grill burgers on Sunday nights. I was the oldest, the helper, the one he told to keep an eye on things when he wasn't home. It made me feel important, even if it really just meant watching my sister while Mom tried to catch her breath. Mom had always been the strong one. She worked until 2 weeks before my sister was born, handling long shifts at the diner while juggling groceries, bills, and everything else. But after the pregnancy, she couldn't find a job willing to accommodate her schedule. She'd spend hours on the kitchen phone, leaving voicemails for employers, her voice growing quieter with each call. Dad, meanwhile, had started drinking heavier than usual, the paycheck barely stretching past rent and his bar tab. The fights started small, comments about how Mom needed to pull her weight. By the time my sister was born, those comments had turned into full-blown shouting matches. I'd sit in my room, pretending to do homework, while their voices carried through the thin walls. The words didn't always make sense to me then, but one thing was clear: money was tight, and Dad wasn't happy. The night things fell apart started like so many others. Mom came home from another interview, looking worn down to her core. Her blouse was wrinkled, and strands of her hair stuck to her forehead. She had spent hours on buses, balancing job applications in one hand and her purse in the other, and now she was greeted by the sight of my dad sprawled out on the couch. His drink sat on the coffee table, sweating in the humid air. My baby sister was wailing in her bassinet, but he just sat there, staring at the TV like the world outside didn't exist. Mom tried to keep it together at first, but you could see the frustration boiling over. She told him how hard she was trying, how exhausting it was to get rejection after rejection. She told him she couldn't keep doing this alone, not with a newborn, not with bills piling up. But Dad didn't take it well. He started in on her, saying how he was the only one keeping the lights on and putting food on the table. The irony stung. Half his paycheck was going straight to the liquor store. I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the bottle I'd been warming for my sister. I wasn't supposed to listen to their arguments, but their words carried through the walls anyway. It was the same cycle every time: Mom, desperate to make him see the cracks forming around us, and Dad, too proud and angry to admit he wasn't doing enough. That night, though, he took it a step further. He got up from the couch, his glass in hand, and made some comment about how everything would be easier if Mom could just pull her weight. He blamed her for not landing a job, even though she'd only stopped working to bring my sister into the world. He said something about having to choose between buying a drink and feeding the family. Then, just like that, he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. No apology. No second thought. The screen door slammed behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. In the days after Dad left, Mom tried her best to hold everything together. She didn't cry in front of me, but I could hear her at night when she thought I was asleep. Her sobs were muffled, quiet, like she didn't want the walls to hear. She spent every waking moment on the phone, calling every diner, retail store, or temp agency within a 10-mile radius. Sometimes, when my sister's cries got too loud, she'd bounce her on one hip while holding the phone in the crook of her neck. She wrote down leads on an old notepad she kept on the kitchen counter, the pages smudged with ink from her rushed handwriting, the rejection letters piled up in a neat little stack by the phone. I'd see her pause sometimes, just staring at them like they were mocking her. It wasn't like she wasn't qualified. She'd worked full-time until my sister was born. But now, with a newborn and no partner to help, it was like the world had decided she didn't belong in it anymore. One afternoon, she got dressed in her best clothes, a pale pink blouse and a pencil skirt she hadn't worn since before the pregnancy. She stood in front of the mirror in our cramped bathroom, applying a bit of makeup and smoothing her hair back. I remember thinking she looked so hopeful, like she was willing herself to believe this interview would be different. I stayed home with my sister, rocking her in my lap while the hours stretched on. When Mom finally came back, her shoulders were slumped, and the hope I'd seen earlier had drained from her face. She didn't say much, just kissed me on the top of my head and thanked me for looking after the baby. But I could tell from the way she walked straight to her room that the interview had been another dead end. Even with everything going on, Mom made sure we never went to bed hungry. Sometimes that meant stretching the last few dollars in her wallet to buy bread, peanut butter, and milk. Other times, it meant sitting at the dining table with an empty plate, while she told me she wasn't hungry. I knew she was lying, but I never called her out on it. Looking back now, I don't know how she managed to keep us afloat. But at 12 years old, all I knew was that my mom was the strongest person I'd ever seen. After months of rejection, Mom finally got a call back. It was for a part-time cashier position at a grocery store on the edge of town. It wasn't much, minimum wage, and no benefits, but it was something. The first time she came home in her new uniform, I could see a flicker of pride in her eyes, like she'd finally caught her footing after months of freefall. The hours were long, and the work wasn't easy. She'd come home with aching feet and hands raw from stocking shelves, but she never complained. She even managed to scrape together enough money to get me a new backpack for school, which I needed since the straps on my old one were held together with duct tape. Things weren't perfect, but they were better. We were surviving, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we had a chance at something more. Then Dad showed up. It was a Friday evening, just after dinner. My sister was asleep in her bassinet, and Mom and I were sitting at the kitchen table, going over my math homework. The knock on the door was sharp and impatient, like whoever was on the other side thought they owned the place. Mom froze for a moment before getting up. When she opened the door, there he was, Dad, standing on the porch, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes were bloodshot. I could smell the whiskey on him from across the room. He started talking before Mom could say anything, going on about how he made a mistake and how he wanted to come home. He said he'd heard from someone at the bar that she'd found a job, and he figured we'd be doing fine now, like that somehow made up for the months he'd been gone. Mom didn't say a word. She just stood there, staring at him with this look I'd never seen before, somewhere between anger and pity. He tried to push past her, saying something about wanting to see his kids, but she stepped in his way. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was steel behind it. She told him he'd lost the right to call us his family the day he walked out that door. Dad turned to me then, his face softening like he thought I'd back him up. "Come on, buddy," he said. "Don't you miss your old man?" I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I could think about was the way he'd left us, how I'd watched Mom struggle and scrape by while he drank his money away. I shook my head, and the look on his face was something I'll never forget. He muttered something under his breath, something about how we'd regret this, and then he stumbled off the porch and into the night. That was the last time I saw my dad. After Dad left for the second time, it was like a weight had been lifted from the house. It wasn't that things got easier overnight. We still had bills to pay, and Mom still came home every night with sore feet and tired eyes. But the tension, the constant waiting for the other shoe to drop, was gone. Mom threw herself into her job, picking up as many extra shifts as she could. She even started saving a little money here and there, stashing it in a coffee can on top of the fridge. I used to see her smile whenever she dropped a few crumpled bills inside. It wasn't much, but to her, it was a symbol of independence, a way of saying that she didn't need him anymore. I stepped up too. I learned how to make simple meals, kept the house as tidy as I could, and did my best to look after my sister when Mom wasn't home. At 12, I didn't fully understand what it meant to take on those responsibilities, but I knew it was important. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proving to ourselves that we were better off without him. We didn't talk about Dad much after that night. The few times I brought him up, Mom would just shake her head and say, "Some people can't handle being part of a family." It wasn't bitter, just matter of fact, like she'd come to terms with it, and didn't have the energy to dwell on something she couldn't change. My sister, of course, didn't understand any of it. She was too young to remember him, and I figured that was for the best. As she got older, she started calling me Dad by accident sometimes, especially when she was learning to talk. Mom would correct her gently, but I never minded. In a way, I liked that she'd never have to know the kind of man he was. Still, there were hard days. There were times when I'd see other kids with their dads, at school events, at the park, even on TV, and feel this strange mix of anger and sadness. I'd wonder why we weren't enough for him, why he couldn't put down the bottle and just be there for us. But those moments never lasted long. I'd look at Mom, at everything she'd done to keep us going, and remind myself that we didn't need him, we had each other, and that was enough. Over time, life started to feel less like survival and more like something solid. Mom's part-time job turned into a full-time position, and eventually, she got promoted to a supervisor role. It wasn't glamorous, but it came with a small raise and enough stability to make a difference. She'd come home tired, but there was pride in the way she carried herself, a quiet sense of accomplishment. With the extra income, we could finally breathe a little easier. Groceries were no longer a constant calculation, and the electricity bill wasn't a source of panic every month. Mom even saved enough to take my sister and me to the movies one weekend, something we hadn't done since before she was born. I'll never forget how excited my sister was, her tiny hands clutching the oversized popcorn bucket while her feet swung above the sticky theater floor. For me, the changes were slower but just as meaningful. I started focusing more on school, knowing that getting good grades was my way of contributing to the family. I didn't have the luxury of being a carefree kid anymore, but that was okay. Every A on a test felt like a small victory, a step towards something better. We also built a new kind of rhythm as a family. Every Friday night, Mom would make spaghetti, the one meal she could cook better than anyone else, and we'd sit around the table, laughing and talking about the little things. My sister would babble about her toys, and I'd tell Mom about my classes. Those dinners weren't fancy, but they felt like home. As the years went by, Dad's absence became less of a wound and more of a scar. It was still there, faint and jagged, but it didn't hurt as much. The few times we heard about him, usually through a distant relative or an old neighbor, it was always the same story. He was still drinking, still drifting from one place to the next, blaming everyone but himself for the mess his life had become. Once, when I was about 15, a relative casually mentioned that he tried to move back into town. Mom didn't say much, but later that night, I heard her on the phone, making it clear to someone that he wasn't welcome anywhere near us. She never told me what was said on that call, but I could tell she was protecting us. She always did. By the time I started high school, it was like we'd built an entirely new life. Dad was a ghost, something we didn't need to acknowledge to keep moving forward. And for the first time, it felt like we had a future. Now, more than a decade later, I'm in my 20s, and my sister just turned 13. She's starting to ask questions about Dad, why he left, who he was, but Mom and I handle it delicately. I tell her the truth, but only the parts she's ready to hear. She doesn't need to know how hard those years were or how close we came to losing everything. Mom's doing better than ever. She saved enough to buy a small house last year, nothing fancy, but it's ours. I helped her paint the walls, and my sister picked out the curtains for her room. Every time I see Mom laughing in the kitchen or watching TV after work, I feel this surge of pride. She didn't just survive, she rebuilt her life from the ground up, one shift, one paycheck at a time. As for Dad, we haven't heard from him in years. He never tried to apologize or make amends, and by now, I doubt he ever will. I've stopped wondering why he left or whether he regrets it. Some people are just wired to run when things get tough, and he was one of them. I've also stopped being angry. It's not forgiveness, exactly, but more of a letting go. Carrying that bitterness around felt like lugging a heavy suitcase through life, unnecessary and exhausting. I don't need it anymore. What I do hold on to are the lessons those years taught me. I learned what resilience looks like from my mom, who never let the weight of the world crush her. I learned how to take responsibility, how to show up for the people who depend on you. And I learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about the ones who stay, who fight alongside you when everything's falling apart. I look at my sister now and see someone who's kind, smart, and full of life. She doesn't remember the worst of those days, and for that I'm grateful. She deserves to grow up without the shadow of what happened hanging over her. We may have started with nothing, but we built something better, a life that's ours, free from the chaos Dad left behind. And as much as I sometimes wonder how different things could have been, I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything.